Hey everyone, welcome back to another edition of Outdoor Hospitality Weekly. Today we're joined by a really cool special guest talking to us about landscape architecture today. We've got Margaret Jankowski, director over at FWD. Margaret, thank you so much for joining us here today.
Glad to be here. Thank you for having me.
To start, for somebody like Matt and I who really don't know a ton about even what a landscape architect does, and hopefully we'll kind of have a chance to dive into this more with you throughout the episode today. What does a landscape architect really do, and can you just introduce to us a little bit about what FWD does as well, and what sort of the firm does in the market?
Yeah, definitely. We're a collective of landscape architects, artists, and urban designers. And our offices are in Brooklyn and Oakland, so we're kind of bi-coastal, but we practice all over. As landscape architects, we really work on any of the spaces that are outdoors. Two of us have background in architecture, so we can really kind of think about buildings and to a certain extent the interiors, but our main focus is what's going on outside of the building walls. So that includes anything from gardens, open spaces, paths, roads, kind of infrastructure, what's underneath the surface. So, anything from if you're in a rural space, septic fields and where those are located, in coordination with engineers, of course, to tree canopies and how light filtering down through that. And really, we focus a lot on the intersection of ecology, how different places can be healthy and kind of resilient and long lasting, and the experience of people on that site. So we know, when you're outdoors, you can be there at any season, and it's very different. And even within one season, the differences between early morning and what's going on in the trees, on the ground, birds, bees, all that kind of stuff is very different than middle of the day or twilight or nighttime. So we kind of really focus on the experiential aspect of being outside, as well as the ecology. And even honestly, the kind of social and cultural side is also really important. Like what has happened here before, how have different histories informed this site, how we get to it, how we think about it in context. There's a lot of cool stuff to weave together in landscape architecture.
Fascinating. I'd love to hear just, you know, when did you decide you wanted to be in landscape architecture? I'd love to hear a little bit about the path in schooling and licensure if you are licensed, and tell us kind of how your path and how people become landscape architects.
Yeah, sure. So my personal path, I went to undergrad in a liberal arts school and had studios for architecture. So my undergrad is a Bachelor of Arts in Architecture. So it's not a professional degree. You can get a professional undergraduate degree, which is, I think, 5 years. I didn't do that. I wasn't sure that I wanted to really go all the way into architecture right from the very beginning, which is probably good because I ended up not going into architecture per se and switching to landscape architecture. But we did have studios. Most of the education is very studio based, which is where it's not really a seminar or a lecture class. You're actually like in addressing a design problem. You have a specific site also often, and you spend a semester trying to understand what that site is and applying, creating a design for whatever the problem is that they've created
It
for you.
sounds a lot
So,
more like lab based. Would that be right? If
yeah,
I'm
it's
kind of
kind of
applying it
lab
to a
based.
science kind of curriculum or something like that, it's very
Yeah,
hands on.
it is very hands-on. I mean, now it's a lot of like computer-based technology, but I think there is still a really strong emphasis on model making, getting out into the field for landscape architects for sure, architects as well. There's always a history component, a theory component, but the main time is just like working through design solutions, testing things out, doing site analysis, and just learning how to design. Like, where do you start? Sometimes, how do you understand what your goals are and iterate over and over to get there? How do you evaluate what you've done and see if you actually achieved what you wanted to do? So we did a lot of design studios. Um, Mine, I think it was the second to last semester of school, they had a landscape architecture focused studio. And I remember thinking like, why are we spending an entire semester on landscape architecture? All you do is put bushes around a building. I was like, well, there must be more to it, I guess, if we're going to spend all this time. And of course, there is a lot more to it. It was an incredible semester, and we learned about urban landscapes, and all of the fabric that kind of knits a city together outside of the buildings, which for me is, I think, where a lot of the life and energy of the city happens. That's how you can kind of get a pulse of a neighborhood or a whole city in itself. Which is true for small towns too. It's like what's happening outside the buildings and what you see when you first arrive. That's all, in my mind, landscape architecture. So after that, I worked for a firm doing high-end residential design in New York and the area around it, and decided I liked it enough to go back to school for it, and went back to school for my master's, focusing on not residential design, focusing on public open spaces and cities especially. But have always kind of kept my pulse on the residential design is a really great way to like, get your hands into the ground and be with the plants and talk to clients directly. Whereas with big public projects, those can often be a lot more long term, and you're a little bit more removed from the process. You're not really building them right away. They take a lot of time and involve maybe large infrastructure pieces, waterfront stabilization, whole neighborhood development, that kind of stuff. So it's great. You can do so much different stuff at very different scales. And part of it, you're always kind of maintaining that connection to nature and being outdoors, which I really like.
Yeah,
Love
that's
it.
awesome. And Margaret, talk a little bit about, you've kind of crossed over into our neck of the woods with outdoor hospitality projects and have worked with Sam, our third partner, on some projects in the past. What does a typical project in the outdoor hospitality space look, and kind of what is your piece of that look like as a landscape architect?
Yeah. It kind of depends. It really might depend on what the site is and where in the process you're being brought on board. We always love to be brought on board pretty early on. Ideally, the person we're working with, whether it's a developer, private client, whoever it is, has some sense of the program that they want, whether it's camping, tents, building based, a combination of them. And they have a kind of preliminary pro forma, so they generally know what they're trying to aim for. But we can come in as early as assessing a site for feasibility to see if we can fit, like, where can we fit the various pieces? How are we looking at access? What are we looking at as far as developable space? How are we thinking about what is the core quality of a place, and how do we make sure that we retain that through the design process? Because there's always a reason why you land on a property as a place where you want to set something up. And we have to understand really what is that? Is it really because of its location, and we need to really reinforce its proximity to certain things, or how easy it is to get to, or partners locally? Or is it about like an incredible bluff and a view and this feeling of being in this kind of open space that you don't get everywhere? And how do we make sure that we're not developing the site in a way that degrades whatever that core essential quality is and actually reinforces it? And sometimes it's hard to understand what that even is in the beginning. So we can kind of come and help put words to that and do that. So we do a lot of working with engineers, sometimes an architect early on, but a lot of times different types of engineers, like a civil, structural, maybe ecological professionals, just to help inform and kind of weave together different narratives about a site and make sure that we're always keeping in mind what is the visitor's experience going to be on the site and what makes this really special for them when they get here.
Super cool. You spoke about a lot of concepts and principles in what you do in landscape architecture, and so many of them are so core and central to outdoor hospitality. I found that super interesting. And as I've learned more about this industry, it's become more and more apparent that a landscape architect, is it's kind of like the quarterback in a lot of ways of a development or a redevelopment, especially with the kind of projects that we do where it's probably, you know, some of the more difficult projects that you'll see
Yeah.
come in front of you because it's all landscape and it's large acreage, right? That's we might park some tiny homes on wheels there, but those are usually prefab and bought as is. You could do some custom stuff too, obviously, but it's really all landscape. So I find that super interesting. Do you find that sometimes it gets to be too much in outdoor hospitality? Like, I would imagine that they're probably some of the more profitable projects you work on, maybe because the fees can get really high. But like, if you compare it to like a mid-rise apartment building or like a suburban office building or something where it's like to the comment you made of like just throw some bushes around the building.
Yeah.
This is a whole different world where it's endless asks and paths and miles of roadway and miles of infrastructure and trees and natural plantings and waterways and different surfaces, and the infrastructure is always a huge undertaking. Do you ever find that it's
Yeah.
like you're like, all right, not another campground, not another glamping resort?
Not yet. I mean, I honestly, sometimes you want to see it like complete and finished and done. But for the most part, like I think we kind of really like the richness of it that you can keep going and there's always more to think about and more to take in. It is a big challenge to, like I said, weave all of these things together into something that's coherent and implementable. I think a lot of times, there is an artistic aspect to what we do, but there's also a really big component to making it feasible. And we know when we're working with developers in outdoor hospitality, we know like building it and making it happen is the main goal. We're not creating like an outdoor museum or something like that. The whole point is to like get people on the site enjoying it and using it. So we try to be pretty flexible, like, have a big vision in mind and have a goal where you want to get to. But no, year one, it's going to look a certain way, and you're going to try and do some pilots maybe, or get some things going, and then building on that in years 2 through 5, and then 10, and really keeping this big picture in mind. That's what we really like doing. So we're kind of
Love it.
in it for the long haul, and we really like working with clients who have an investment in the long-term part of a site and who want to see it evolve and change and care for it over the long term.
Nice, nice. I'd love to dig into some kind of, we'll keep it high level and keep it educational and for people who don't are not industry experts, but I'd love to dig into some of the process and kind of technical stuff.
Yeah.
Alex, you have anything before we jump into some process stuff?
No, I don't think so.
Cool. Awesome. So we call it initial planning, which kind of encompasses a lot of things. It's conceptualizing the project. It can be the whole front end of the investment of finding the property, doing your due diligence, kind of figuring out your plan, your concept. And then next, usually the way we see it play out is, like you said, we could very well use the services of a landscape architect in initial planning. Next, and correct me if I'm wrong here, because you're the expert, I'm certainly not. Initial planning would be followed by master planning. Is that? And then I've always been intrigued by this term and concept of master planning.
Yeah.
So if you could like take us through that. I've learned a lot about it in the last, few years as I've kind of gotten into some of these projects. But like my first question was always like, is a master plan like a standardized deliverable?
Right.
Like Do I know I'm looking at a master plan? What is that? So if you could
Right.
just
No, those
from the
are
top, like
totally
walk us through
valid.
master planning.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, well, to that, there is not like a standard master plan. There are like technical requirements for actual design documentation from schematic design, design development, construction documentation. So there are, you can like adhere to very specific rules for those things, and you should. For a master plan, it can kind of be whatever you need, and it can be a little tricky. Sometimes we've been talking about them as framework plans or framework visions. I think a lot of times the idea of a master plan has been like this, like looking down from above, planning out every little step so that you know every move for the next 5 years or however long, which in reality is just not the way that things work.
Right.
And what we try to do instead is develop kind of a framework that we can scaffold design decisions onto so that you have the tools to say, okay, we know what our goals are for this site. We know what our values are as a developer or as a brand. And here are the ways that those translate into design and investment decisions on the campus. And here are the things that are going to need to happen over the next few years as far as maintenance, investments, decisions, all that kind of stuff. So here's how it might plot out, and here's a vision of how it can look. But we know it needs to be flexible so that, you know, year two, you're digging up phase three, and there's some kind of archaeological artifacts underneath, and you're like, okay, this is wasn't accounted for, and now we're gonna accommodate it. And it should be a framework that's flexible enough that you can say, you know, here's how we can incorporate this or work around this and still get to our ultimate goal, whether that's a certain number of units or keys or a kind of program goal or a feeling. So yeah, there's not the standard master plan. Um,
Gotcha.
but we've done like anything from strategic plans where you're really helping play out different scenarios of, are we even looking at tents or platforms or one large structure with different iterations around it, to an actual plan forward with implementable phases that are then costed so that you can make a 10-year budget. So the level of detail can really depend on what you need. But that's something that we also can help say to you. Like you say, I need some
Right.
kind of plan. And then we work through it with you to say, all right, what is the scope going to be? What do you actually need? And what do you have the appetite and budget for right now? Because you may ultimately want a really detailed investment and design plan, but you just need something right now to just start and get in the ground and get on the site. So we can kind of expand it as we need to.
Do you ever go into that sort of planning period, whether it's strategic or master plan, with somebody who has unrealistic expectations, kind of one way or the other? And how do you kind of walk them through that, whether it's, as you just discussed, adding a number of units in an unreasonable timeline for the site and budget and appetite that they have for that, and kind of how do you kind of overcome that maybe misconception that all somebody needs is the plan that's going to solve all the problems when it comes to timing and budget, and how do you begin to work through that with the client?
Yeah, that can be really challenging. I have a lot of sympathy for clients, especially if they've never done a big project. Like, some people will develop multiple buildings in their lifetime, or even individuals. You might build a house or two in your lifetime. Most people are not doing, large 100 acre developments in their lifetime. If you're really in the outdoor hospitality sector and you're doing that a lot, then you will have a sense of it, but sometimes it's their first time. So there is a lot of kind of, I don't know if education is the right word,
Hand
but
holding a little
working,
bit.
yeah, working through it with them and helping them to understand like what is realistic and how do we get you the answers that you need in order to define what it is that we're even doing here. So we work a lot, like I mentioned, we work with architects, engineers, We also work with cost estimators who can be very helpful in having conversations. They have different magnitudes of estimate depending on what level of detail you have. So if you're super early on in a project, you're getting a high level cost estimate that makes a lot of assumptions, but gives you some kind of ballpark figure that then they can use to gut check, like, oh, that's, a lot more than I thought. I need to recalibrate, or, great, this is in line with what we had been hoping for. Because I mean, I don't know if you've never done one before, if you've only done one in a certain area, and now you're in a new area, you don't really have a basis for understanding that. So that's kind of step one is working to understand the parameters. We will often also share case studies with people. So cost comparison case studies are not always very useful because there are so many different reasons why things cost differently, mostly like underground. If you're doing a lot of like utility or infrastructure work underground, that can really affect what your ultimate cost is. Um, but it can be helpful for clients to see other projects that we've done, how they compare acreage wise, how much of the property is dedicated to units, to roads, to open space, to program space. Um, that can, like, how much it costs per acre and what the level of design is that they got for that. And sometimes even like what is the annual operating and maintenance budget? Because that's an area that I think a lot of people are really caught off guard. Like you're making these big investments in a property, and then you're like, what? We have to continue to pay. It can be up to a third of the capital investment every year, which is a
Yeah.
lot. So we see this in public space too. People, give a beautiful gift of X million dollars to make a park, and then it has no operating budget or maintenance fund. So helping think through, and that's where our experience, not only master planning, but seeing things through to construction and having a long-term relationship with the client can really help because sometimes we just know if they're asking for, I don't know, like a lot of imported granite for the paths or some kind of thing where you're like, that's not where you're going to get a lot of value. You're going to like blow your budget just there. And we can talk about those sort of things and how it will actually maybe play out. But there's a lot of conversations, definitely.
Yeah, 100%. So let's get back to the design process. Correct me if I'm wrong here, but so we covered master planning.
Hmm.
I would imagine throughout this process, it's not a linear, like finish one process, start the next. There's probably some overlap. Schematic design would be what we jump into next. Once
Yeah.
master planning is at a certain point,
Yeah,
and
if you take your master plan to a certain level, then you can hop right into schematic. Usually what we'll end up doing with a large, especially in outdoor hospitality, you end up having phases. So your
Mhm.
master plan will
Hmm.
identify phases. Maybe you take phase one all the way through to SD right away, and you have a set that knows where everything is laid out. You have a good sense of, just whatever the takeoffs are that need to be costed, and you can get a pretty good cost for something like that. But the rest of the master plan maybe only has a higher order of magnitude cost. Or you cost out most of the phases roughly, and you pick what your pilot phase and really cost that out at SD. But yeah, usually we'll end up taking a certain part of it to a certain higher level of design and finishing out an SD set, though you don't have to.
Interesting,
Yeah.
interesting. So SD schematic design
Yeah.
is, your master plan is conceptual and sort of directional and high level, and then it sounds to me like schematic design is really where you have to get down into the details and make some decisions about materials or locations or really like detailed design
Hmm.
decisions, and then that really where kind of the cost of the project you can start to kind of zero in on costs.
Yeah, the master plan should really outline an overall vision and concept. And you start to form ideas about what materials are you going to use, what planting are you going to use. You have ideas about like rough amounts of what's hardscape, what's softscape, rough infrastructure costs. is it feasible to actually put this road here versus there? That sort of thing. Then in SD schematic design, you're really focusing on making sure you know where things are laid out and you're accounting for not only the road width itself, but the shoulder and the maintenance path and the storage areas, and all of the program is actually accounted for and laid out on the site. And then you also refine your material palette, furnishings, lighting, ideas, that kind of thing. You take it one step further. And then in design development, that would come next. That's where you're really honing in on exactly what are these materials. You're specifying, specifically the kind of stone or paver or gravel or something like that. You're really finding or designing pieces of furniture, lighting fixtures, all of that, like the actual materiality of it gets much more developed in design development documents. And then you move on to construction documentation, which is like the details of how things will be built. How is this bench anchored into the ground? I don't, usually someone else would be figuring out like how is the tent. We work a lot in close coordination with a structural engineer at that
Sure.
stage. Electrical MEP, all sorts of different engineers, civil engineers. So we coordinate together to make sure that this is actually buildable, and then that is where you get your highest level of costing, and that's when it will actually, when that's complete, go out to bid and be built. If that's the way that you're doing it. There's also design builds that is actually very common, I think, in outdoor hospitality. If you're already working with a contractor that you trust, they can help develop certain details and develop the costing even. But that's your design bid build process if you're taking it all the way through construction documentation. So you do kind of have to go through all the stages. There are always like there have been times when people have wanted to skip something or get a contractor on board based on DD documents. That's always risky because you just don't have the level of detail that you would have later on. And it's kind of a toss-up if you're actually saving money in the end or not, because there are going to be things you just hadn't had time to develop that will pop up eventually, and then the costs change orders come, all that kind of stuff. So yeah, that process has, and it's similar for architecture as well. So we're often aligned if the project includes built structures, new construction or renovation. We kind of try to align ourselves to the same schedule so that you're getting these documentation packages at the same time and like thinking about the whole project itself.
Makes a lot of sense. So just to review a little bit here. So we have schematic design, SD for those in the know. Is kind of the deliverable or the kind of demarcation of let's move on to design development is you have initial floor plans and site plans, exterior concepts in place, and then you're ready to drill down into it. You referred to it as a higher level of design, which would be more detail, more decisions made in design development, where you're drilling down into the materials, like you said.
Yeah.
And from what I've learned, that's kind of where the whole design team gets on the same page with a lot of things. So if you don't mind, walk us through what a typical design team looks like in these types of projects.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that also depends a little bit on the project itself and what it needs,
Sure.
but typically, you will need engineers of some sort. So likely a civil engineer, whose focus may be on roadways, traffic, grading, water flow, that sort of stuff. We work very closely with them a lot of the time. Um, you could need a structural engineer depending on what you actually want to build, where you're putting your platforms, if you're having, I don't know, like lookout towers or canopies or that kind of thing. MEP, mechanical, electrical, plumbing, if you have those kind of needs. There maybe geotechnical engineers as well if you're trying to understand the soils and that kind of thing. So there's a whole engineering team They could come, some of them could come on pretty early. Sometimes what we do is like to get the master plan or maybe even SD pretty well underway and then bring them on because then they know what the scope is and they can very clearly give a budget for their services and know exactly what they're going to do. If they're coming on earlier than that, it's usually in a kind of consulting, red flag advisory review role. Though not always, but that can be really helpful to have an engineer doing a red flag review on, especially if they're local and they know the codes and the kind of things to look out for, permitting, agency review, that sort of thing. So engineers is one, architects is another one. If there are existing or new structures on the site, we'd probably want to be in conversation with an architect in SD, definitely. Could be again consulting in the master plan just to if there's any tricky program for a building that you really need to work through, like food service or specialty needs for, I don't know, spa or something like that. If you're really like going to be developing those sort of things, then earlier would be better. But they'll certainly come on board once you know if there's a building that is included in the phase that you're going to take through to construction, then you didn't need to have an architect on board. If you're just kind of planning the overall site, you don't necessarily need one yet. And then there are many other kind of specialists that might come into play depending on the project, ranging from ecologists could be very helpful in understanding how to care and plan for the care of the site. Um, Artists can be very interesting, especially if there's a connection with the surrounding community or if there's, really a kind of artsy feel, or if that's something that can differentiate this property from something else, whether that's permanent art like sculpture or whether that's more experiential. Maybe there's an art program that rotates every year and that's what is becoming really well known for the property. So we've worked with artists as well. Archaeologists, if sometimes you need an archaeologist to get the phase one environmental review process going. Sometimes you just find something and then you need to engage an archaeologist. Historians, we've worked with them, which can be, again, another way to think about and find the unique qualities of a site because people get really excited about knowing what was there before, and people who are history buffs are really, really into history. Similarly, with an ecologist, people who are into like bird watching, super into bird watching. So depending on, where the client wants to go and what is already there on the site, we may kind of recommend pulling in different specialists or experts to really deepen that aspect of the project.
Love it. Love it. So next, we've covered schematic design, design development. Next would be construction documentation, which is kind of the culmination of the design process where everything is documented. You should have a really close idea of what things are going to cost. I want to go back to some of the things you said, and I think this is such an interesting conversation for a lot of people. Outdoor hospitality is a very buzzy industry. Lots of real estate people, real estate investors jumping into the space, all the way out, from individual investors doing small projects to huge private equity companies pouring millions and millions of dollars into the space. And I think there is just it's a generalization here, but I think there's maybe ignorance or just lack of education or adoption of this approach. I think a lot of people think outdoor hospitality is like a high cash flow, low capex type of investment, even on the development side. So you just listed so many things, so many different design team members and consultants and professionals. And that's my background, is commercial real estate finance and investments. I fell into this space. I love it. But me from like 5-7 years ago, I hear that and I'm like, that sounds insanely expensive.
Yeah.
Like, and one of the things that just was so eye-opening to me once I started diving into these types of development projects was how much soft costs can cost. You know, you think, oh, okay, some glamping tents, some, you know, 70, 80, $100,000 prefab cabins on wheels, some infrastructure, you know, and then you go and you actually talk to a professional who's done it before, and you look at it and it's the soft costs can be 20 to 30% of even like the whole project cost on the high end, I think. So anything you can share with people who are like thinking about getting, oh, I'm going to build my first glamping resort, or I'm going to build a campground or redevelop a campground, just kind of mindset around, you know, not skimping on professionals to design it right and start the project off from a good foundation and just put it in the right direction. Because I see that all the time of, oh, 500 million.
All we see is people trying to cram as much sites and
Right.
revenue in as possible.
Right.
Or
That's
people-
how you maximize like your
Right.
revenue for a little while at least.
Right.
Right.
And people get into projects. We've seen it where people buy land and they're probably uneducated on the design process. And then they see, oh my God, it's going to be $500,000 in soft costs or $1 million in soft costs. And that's kind of like, you know, a lot of the stuff we talked about is like before you can even have a true refined budget. Whereas the real estate investor mentality is, I'm going to have my whole budget and all my finances worked out before I even close on the before I even make an
Right.
offer on the property, which is just not, I mean, yeah, you can do your numbers and hopefully you're conservative and within the realm of you know, what's possible. But we just see that so often that people underestimate the soft costs, underestimate the design process, or kind of belittle it. I don't know if that's the right word,
Yeah.
but like don't place the importance on it. So just talk to us a little bit about doing it the right way.
Yeah, what would you say to that person if they're in that spot?
Yeah. I mean, I think what you said is really good. You've probably seen more kind of tricky situations than we have because as designers, most of the time people are coming to us because they know they need us. They may not know exactly how they need us, or they may not know exactly what we do, but they know they need something and we help them figure it out. But certainly I can imagine there are ways to really get into a tough spot if you don't have the proper planning up front. Anything from, you know, for example, the idea of the carrying capacity of a site, which is when you're asking like, what can the site handle volume wise, not from a revenue and like space cramming perspective, but from kind of an experiential quality perspective. So if what you love and are drawn to about a certain site is this incredible meadow space that is quiet and contemplative, or it's walking through the woods, or there's some kind of like solitude aspect to being outside that people seek out. If you bring so many people on site that you ruin that, and everyone can hear everybody else like talking and chatting, or you're trying to just like have a quiet moment, but there's people walking past you every 2 minutes, that's not what people want in the end. So you've kind of breached the carrying capacity of this site. Or even worse, you start to have issues with, you know, you didn't plan it properly, and now the road you put in to access the new area is having erosion issues, and you know the water is kind of flowing everywhere, causing drainage, ponding. Now you have like a lot more ticks and a lot more bugs, and it's just not nice. Or you know, you just did something wrong. And those can be very expensive things to fix once you kind of degrade a certain aspect of the site. So you want to avoid that, obviously. And there can be other things too. I mean, you don't, that's the tricky part. You don't always know what you're going to run into. And even if you do your due diligence, you will, that's the nature of construction and design. You'll always find something that you don't expect. Hopefully, it's not something that's like a project killer. And we do our best to highlight and do due diligence on as many of those things as we can. Anything from like the basic stuff, like understanding where designated wetlands are, understanding permitting processes, understanding zoning if that's coming into play, that sort of stuff is really basic. And you can have a designer do that, or some clients are able to do that as well. But then there are other things as well, like I said, knowing where to place roads, knowing how to properly site different things so that you're really maximizing the potential of this site from an experiential point of view, so that people have the incredible views that remind them of how amazing it is to be in nature, and they come back every year so that they can have their early morning bird watching, and the birds are still coming because they're not freaked out by too many people
Yeah.
and trucks and lights at night or whatever. So that kind of having conversations with people about that and helping them think through what it takes to plan and build a site can be really helpful. But I'm sure you've heard, like horror stories, and that can also be helpful. So you guys definitely have a role to play as well, as far as speaking to what it's like to be a client and to be a developer of a site, because we're the designers and we support it. But like I said, it's a big endeavor. And we understand that it's a lot of big decisions have to be made. So not
Well
easy.
said.
Yeah, I think to that kind of end, I think we see so many people kind of lose the outdoor part of outdoor hospitality, and that's where
Yeah.
there's just such importance to have somebody like you guys kind of come into the picture. As we start to kind of wrap up here, give us that piece of advice, maybe separate from what we've kind of already talked about, for that developer or that person who's about to purchase that land, or about to kind of go on that adventure to add in a bunch of sites to their property. What's that one piece of advice you'd give to developers about specifically the landscape design piece of
Yeah.
this, and something to really look out for, and why somebody maybe would even consider working with you guys at FWD?
Yeah. I would say think about the big picture. Try to understand what makes your place special. And then know that you don't have to make all the decisions yourself. That's kind of the point of bringing a designer on board early on, is to, they're the ones, if you get a good landscape architect, they will weave together all the different inputs from the engineers, from the architects, from you, from whatever stakeholders you have, into a coherent vision and then design that's implementable, so that you can focus on what makes this exciting for you. You can focus on the actual financial side that you're preparing, the kind of all the other marketing, development, that kind of stuff, so that you're not stuck dealing with design issues that someone else can handle for you and kind of walk you through it. So yeah, I'd say find a good landscape architect, someone that has experience working with a lot of layers of information on complex projects, because they may seem simple, but these projects do have a lot of layers and a lot of things that can come up. So best case scenario, you go through a master plan and it is very simple and you don't need to bring on board a million engineers and stuff, but you'll at least be in good hands and have someone that can help focus where that energy needs to go and do it as hopefully efficiently and maybe even fun as possible. Because, it's work, but it's nice when these things are a little bit enjoyable too.
Well
Well said.
said.
And then, yeah, if somebody does kind of want to connect with you all, or get a sense of the work you guys have done in the past, where can they go to reach out?
Yeah, our website is fwd.land. Um,
How fitting.
and Yes, I know. It worked well having that kind of dot land. And then our email is hello@forward.land, FWD.land. So hopefully either of those will get you to us. And yeah, we're happy to chat with people who are thinking about this sort of thing. And you know, if it's the right stage for us to come in, we can talk more about that. And if it's not, generally we like to help people get where they're going anyway. So we can certainly recommend other paths, other people to talk to, that sort of thing. So we have a very collaborative and kind of collective approach to this at our firm. So
Beautiful.
Awesome. Margaret, I think this was great. I feel like we could talk for another 3 hours going
yeah.
deeper into each of these different areas, and hopefully we'll invite you back on soon to continue the conversation and talk more about this, because it's super interesting for Matt and I as folks kind of outside the landscape architecture kind of industry. And so, yeah, really enjoyed our time together today and really appreciate you coming on.
Yeah, likewise. It was great to be here and hope we can do it again.
That'd be great.
Thanks, Margaret.
Thank you.